Hello everyone, today we talk about monarchy, principalities and society in late medieval France, say 14th and 15th centuries. We've made already a video about the Kingdom of England in this regard, just recently something about communal Italy. So let's observe the Kingdom of France in what is objectively one of the most difficult phases of its history at this point, due to the 100 Years' War, but more in general, the crisis of the 14th century, and how the monarchy, right, here we're talking literally about a royaume, right, this is a kingdom. France is the most kingdom thing you can find. At this point, it's the largest kingdom in Europe. It's the most powerful indeed, but at the same time, it's emerging from a time that is a whole different page of medieval civilization compared to the late medieval ones. It is, in fact, the high or low medieval reign, right? The crisis of the 14th century is effectively what marks this watershed, approximately between this, if you want, hypertrophic European system that definitely develops with displaying very original and positive features, right? But at the same time, is to be necessarily reshaped in front of the crisis and with more robust political and institutional structures, which is a bit the trend that we have observed so far, talking about this time many times in general, to see how objectively medieval civilization made it, right? It didn't evolve into a crisis from which it couldn't recover, right? It was, on the contrary, the major blow of the 14th century, a boost to the strengthening of such systems. And yet, we don't have to interpret this phase in history as deterministically, not even progressively, in the sense, especially the Kingdom of France makes a good example in this regard, because we are used legitimately, right, as a historiographical interpretation to identify a sort of continuity from political, institutional, cultural, even identity point of view. What we call France, as a matter of fact, throughout a very long time. I myself indulge into this idea that the foundation of what would become France is objectively started back in the day with Clovis, the foundation of Francia, and this monarchy that is also a dynasty and a personal dynasty, where the monarch has objectively a greater power than in other kingdoms, right? And yet, if you look at French history in this, French, what would become French history in this flow, in this stream, you realize that there were major of massive crises in which France risked objectively to be wiped out as such, right? As a unity, and this went on actually throughout history, because think at now you can think of the crisis of the Merovingians, of the Carolingians, the political fragmentation in post-Carolingian times, because really, literally, the Western Frankish kingdom was about to disappear. There were other kingdoms that eventually didn't make it, that were more promising at that point. The struggle against the English and the Germans at the end of the 12th, and especially in the beginning of the 13th century. Then there is the victory of Bouvines, and the foundation of what we see as properly as France, as Philip Augustus makes the system transitioning from the Western Frankish kingdom into Royaume de France in French, in vernacular French, passing in from Latin, so giving this strong, actually national character to the monarchy, right? And this is an important feature that it starts having soundly from here, because objectively, the monarchy had survived thanks to the Capetians, etc. But as you know, it didn't control up to that point, and up to the mid, substantially 13th century, the majority of the territory that pertained nominally to the French king, that is, roughly what is today's France, with a bit less of land in the east, but eventually the 100 Years' War is another major. So between the 13th and the beginning of 14th century, France is a superpower for the European standards of the time. It's an immense thing. It's more like an empire by many standards. Its dependencies and dynastic ties stretch from the Channel to Turkey. The Angevins settle in Naples, in Hungary, in Poland. I mean, it's really a big system. Then eventually this crumbles once again. And objectively, up to the beginning, the mid 15th century, France risked to be not eliminated, because the 100 Years' War, after all, was a dynastic struggle. So France would have not ended as a kingdom. On the contrary, like the English kings at that point wanted to be effectively French kings of France, right? As they would essentially, demand up to the end, if I'm not wrong, of the Napoleonic Wars. But then there is other moments of crisis with the wars of religion. In the let's leave aside, the wars of Italy, where at some point France risked to be overrun. But think about the disintegration with the clashes of religion, all the great coalition at the time of the Sun King between the end of the second half of the 17th and the beginning of the 18th century. I mean, this major giant that hegemonizes, partly at least, the European continent, for which all the other countries literally have to coalesce against it. And in the French Revolution, I mean, France has it has this big characteristic that is a massive agricultural and demographic center. It's a big system that it's been used to be ruled by a monarchic, hence a more unitary fashion than basically any other kingdom. Like just England can compare partly to Iberian monarchies, but in practice, the prerogatives of the French monarch are the ones that in the political, institutional, even juridical practice will acquire more legitimization from the side of the communities of the kingdom. And today we observe exactly this side of the story. I mean, how did the French manage to reinforce their structures during the terrible moment of crisis, especially the 14th and beginning of the 15th century, right? Because literally, at this point, the French monarchy, with the 100 Years' War, risked to be cancelled, right? So we have necessarily to start from the time of Philip IV, Philip the Fair, right? This great king. I had a pleasant, I must say, discussion more than 1 year ago when I was presenting Philip as a great sovereign. And my definition of greatness stands in the major, not just the achievements, because things can go wrong, but I mean the capacities in general and the influence. And there's an enormous debate, so I will not start to point out what makes it a great sovereign or not, or whether what should be the criterion of interpretation. But indeed, it's a figure that was incredibly important for the structuring of the French monarchy, for the consolidation of it in many ways, and also in beginning or at least reinforcing further and expanding a concept of the sacrality, as you know, of the French monarchy, in a moment in which the Holy Roman Imperial Authority had basically shrank to very few, and the papacy also was trying to extend its own prerogatives, in fact in competition with an ally, because France and Rome in this sense were allies, right? But so in 1283, Philippe de Beaumanoir was a nobleman and a jurist and a royal bailiff, began to write the Coutume du Beauvaisis, if I pronounce it correctly. That is a region, the one of Beauvais, that he was contributing at that point to administer, to manage. And after 2 centuries, in 1454, Louis XI ordered to his functionaries to collect in written form the ensemble of the customs of the kingdom, right? So this is an important process that we will see also in that in the series about medieval law, right? I mean, we also partly discussed this. If you look at that video that is the Mos Gallicus, that is Roman law in France, we observed this as the French monarchy basically began to collect all the customs of the various communities living under the French monarchy to effectively order them and to extend a certain degree of control and also intervening in them in a way that was somewhat opposite to what the juridical norm of the Middle Ages was, as basically the king was called chiefly just to protect these customs, not to modify or intervene in them. But the French crown in this regard, from the height of its political military power, its early forms of administration, etc., is essentially also helping in a certain way the local elites, as we will see now, to essentially simplify all this forest of various customs that are typical of the Ancien Régime, and it was still criticized in a moment of way greater uniformation before the French Revolution, right? But the point was exactly this, and in France, this is a successful experiment. That is, this especially in the late medieval times, that there is a sort of French juridical tendency from the same communities of the kingdom, frankly, and because exactly of the dreadful and traumatic blows suffered during the 100 Years' War, to essentially grant the king a margin of intervention and even a modification of local customs, or better, of integration. In the case, it would be a vacuum, a law that effectively couldn't discipline certain cases. And this is very important because it tells you how it happened in other times in French history, how the monarchy was seen in many ways as or the central government in general, still today by many standards in French political culture, as a sort of something more than a simple earthly institution. Like, it's kind of ironic talking about in contemporary times, but don't think that the French have sound trust in and admiration towards the idea of France as such, as a state, as in a unitary fashion, right? Doesn't matter whether we're talking about monarchs or about republics. There is definitely the sum of centuries of unitary institutional tradition that wakes definitely in the history of a country, right? So in these juridical collections, albeit not being, and these were issued by the king himself, remember, didn't have an immediate application, right? This is a process that went on for a long time, but it's still very important to observe that this started pretty early, right? From the late 13th century, in coordinating, the single sources of law with a direct normative intervention from the side of the monarchy that intended at least to superimpose royal order to the multiplicity of the local particularisms. And in order to govern, this is very important. You can't think government to be hyper, articulated and complicated, because at that point it would backfire. The task of government is primarily to ensure peace, order, justice, right? And from that, everything can depart. So if these various customs create occasion of conflict, right, it's the same communities that will be, open to negotiate with a higher power, especially something, let's say, more convenient for them. Consider in this regard that the major opposant of these maneuvers weren't much the local I mean, the community is meant as the average people, right? But chiefly the nobility, because the French nobility, by culture, by tradition, had this massive, hyper, confidence in itself. Like they regarded themselves as still, true, the highest nobility of Europe, and objectively, in chivalric terms, that they felt the simple, France is a symbol of Christianity, of military might. They had never got over the fact that a monarchy was forming, that a centralized government was also working through non-noble functionaries, as we will see now. So people that were conceived as inferior by the nobility could, come in their land and say, and to negotiate with their prerogatives. This was a great problem. This is the real point of this also in other countries at this point in history. That is, you have to fight against a resistance, especially of those local powers that have a deep rooting in the territory, that have their own clientage, that have their private power. France, for centuries, had been the cradle of private institutions in many ways, right? At the same time, the public paradoxically emerged strongly also from this country, so that, in fact, at the end of the Middle Ages, the thing that gets closest to a state in Europe is objectively France, right? And this is interesting because, as we often stress, this Frankish political culture hadn't, in origin, actually quite helped this process to happen. So definitely what also happens from the especially from the 12th, in the beginning of the 13th century in France, is something fairly new for the same French. And this naturally brings a resistance, especially from the nobility. And it's not strange at all, actually, that the same monarchy that was old but definitely very democratic in mindset, let's put it, democratic is an anachronistic term, but you understand what I mean. They thought that the peasantry were scum or subhumans alike, just as the nobility that they were themselves, right? But they often played together with the communes, usually, right, rather than these French cities, especially in the northeast of Picardy. Those areas were quite developed to counter these big, the high nobility, right? The same bishops sometimes that were strong allies in general of the French monarchy, and the lay nobility. It was equally powerful, had created vast seigneuries in here. So this work of juridical uniformation, at first glance, could seem to repropose a sort of traditional vision in the progresses of the monarchic control of France that, in fact, has been seen, generally speaking, as this, cradle of the modern state. Modern literally meant as, part of the modern age, as a symbol. And in telling the truth, because this process had started, in fact, as we've seen, since the previous centuries, but really, protagonists, modalities, and steps of this process of a late medieval political construction of the French kingdom are deeply intertwined, and not always in a linear way, since Louis the Ninth, Saint Louis, and Louis the 11th, right, to the end of the Middle Ages. So from one side, it's true that from the government of Philip the Fair, the royal necessities of administrative and tax and military, physical and military control on the territory favored the growth of central and local apparatuses of government that contributed in turn to form, especially in Paris and in a juridical environment, groups of professional and specialized officials, right? But on the other hand, exactly in the 14th century, you can witness the development of new princely political centers that were situated both at the margins, but sometimes within also the same French kingdom. I mean, the best example is definitely the Burgundian one. That was exactly they were the same Valois, right, family, that ruled from here, but that started from the base of the Burgundian duchy to build a territorial dominion that effectively extended far and wide, also within, but also especially externally to France, basically forming what was by the 15th century definitely a state on its own, right? More composite, definitely French kingdom, less cohesive in some ways, so that eventually it probably was more limited, but also it was very advanced in many ways, combining French political military culture with a bit more of this middle classes, especially from the areas of Flanders and this city-states, etc. But the point here is, what's the point exactly? The point exactly is that, we can see progressively this thread of France evolving from the time, especially of Louis IX, that incorporates this finally, after generations of struggles, this enormous amount of lands, especially in southern France, that provide also the monarchy with a port. Eggmark, if you haven't visited there, go there, it's beautiful. It makes you understand a lot about the same vision of these French kings in the Mediterranean, like to invade Egypt, to get to Jerusalem, etc. So, universalistic picture that is definitely, what the French monarchy at that time was thinking like. So beyond even the national character. So, and if you look at the development of this princely power in France itself, you realize, however, it's as if there were kind of smaller states, small but still powerful, Burgundy being exactly the brightest example, that were, in a certain sense, competitive to the same French crown. And when you look at medieval powers, in fact, this is, generally speaking, the key of interpretation. You can, there's this, in fact, anachronistic idea that everything had to pass through centralization by default, because normally in these kingdoms this was not possible, and the best way to do it, to extend the power of the kingdom in the Middle Ages, was extending the nets of relation of the kingdom itself, even territorially speaking, right? What were the entities like the Holy Roman Empire, but the same France at this point? Well, they weren't centralized governments. These were all kind of different chunks of regional, provincial power that were cooperating in like a clientele towards a common direction, right? You can look at the Ottonian Empire back in the day, in the 10th century, and say, these guys were ruling over Europe and Mediterranean because they were emperor. They barely controlled Saxony and Franconia in Germany, right? But the point is that they managed to extend their power to encompass countries like Italy, like controlling Rome, etc. And the French, in this regard, are doing a bit the same thing. They realize they can't stress too much, they can't strain too much the relations with the local nobility, and therefore they have to venture somewhere else, right? That eventually 19th century nationalistic historiography has criticized, as essentially a chimeric policy, right? This happened in Germany for the Hohenstaufen, and partly happened for, probably, I'm not sure of it, but possibly also for Louis IX. This idea of the Mediterranean dream, right, that drew away resources from the lands of origins of these peoples that had instead to unify according to the nation, whatever, right? These people evidently were understanding, French king of the 13th century way better, what the world was at the time than we do, right? And we should just be silent and listen to history in this regard to understand why they were doing this. And definitely, this was still a situation up to, in fact, the end of the Hundred Years' War, in which, and beyond, in which the French monarchy was not necessary to consolidate, definitely, under this nucleus, right? Think at the beginning of the 16th century, the state of the Bourbon, right? They ally even with the Spanish, the switch side, they start fighting against the French kings. That was a perfectly French power in the heart of France itself, that detached itself from the monarchy and began to do other stuff, and that was definitely competing with the Valois-Angoulême at that point for the same French crown. And this is a nutshell the history of the early modern state in general, and always this difficulty in basing power on a permanent and continuous fashion. The point was also resources, right? If you look at episodes like the invasion of Flanders during the reign of Philip the Fair, the invasion of Flanders, the destruction of the Templars, the robbing of the Lombards and of the Jews. Well, this is something you see, countless times. It's like the Anglican reform in the Tudor times to confiscate all the monasteries. All of this idea of seizing as much as you can at the moment, because objectively there are not statal apparatuses that provide you with a constant flux of money in your trunks, and there is not much to criticize in this regard. Those were the only, the best economical means to make it at that time, and these monarchies were constantly challenged for, threatened by, from annihilation, right? To be wiped out from a moment to another. This was true for most, and this is in many ways true also in many contemporary contexts as well, right? By the way, these powers were chronically always indebted, were always short of money. They had enormous financial problems, especially at this time. They really were, the building of the same statal apparatuses to produce, to collect taxes was expensive in itself. So it was always a very delicate balance. At this point in the system was contracting, right? In the 14th century all over the continent. Well, the crisis was just behind the corner, so it happened. So the interesting thing about the development of these princely, let's call them, political centers, states, or whatever. I mean, the terminology here can be, when I say state, it's obviously not, a matter of modern state as we intend it today, but still an entity that had its own political and military autonomy in the kingdom. Within the royal boundary, the kingdom's boundaries. And the interesting thing is that these entities work through the imitatio regni themselves, right? They are taking as a model for their state the same French monarchy. Burgundy is the best example of it. It was objectively a copy of the French court, even surpassing it by certain standards in terms of chivalric fame and prestige and wealth and so on. There are also different kind of characters of these courts based on their moral code. I mean, what the political picture mandated. Philip IV was behaving like a motionless, idling, hieratic statue that had to reflect the imperturbability of the greater sovereign of Christianity, challenging even the universal powers of the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy. Right? It was all the French court was normally by tradition very stern, right? Very very powerful, so showing all this moderation in customs, extremely pious in the face. If you go to the scandals that actually happened during the time of Philip IV, but the political image was that one. And the imitatio regni passed through in this princely powers through the creation of courts, of chivalric order, administrations, right? Fiscalism. Consider that France at this point is allied with, as we were saying before, with the papacy, right? There is also the beginning of the 14th century, the shift of the papal curia to Avignon from Italy, and there is in fact a Capetian branch in Naples as well. That is also very, very advanced because it has inherited the Norman and Swabian subtle traditions of centralization. And what we call bureaucracy, as this is often what I say, an anti-modernistic approach, is that it's not born in 18th century France. What we call bureaucracy, aside you could look at, the Constantinopolitan Church and the level of development that existed at this point in pre-modern times was definitely already in modern times in many ways. But in the West, look at Rome, look especially at Avignon and in Naples, right? And this was a Guelph, an Angevin, if you want, a French, Philo-French, at least bloc, right? And Paris did benefit enormously from the bureaucracy that was born exactly in these centers, right? The papal treasury here had to, I don't remember actually how much the traffic of money they had at tax collection, but I mean it was an enormous amount of money, right? And more than the one in the Kingdom of France, actually, if I'm not wrong. But at the same time, the French kings drew heavily from these models, and this contributed on a pre-existing centralistic apparatus that had been developed since the time of the 13th century to make it ever more robust. And at the same time, the princely states contribute also to limit literally the territorial areas of expansion of the Valois power. Right, at this point, obviously, political and military power is very tied to the land, to a specific extensive dimension, and you know that the French power was revolving around the Ile-de-France, historically speaking. So this area was pretty fertile, that represented the bulk of French power. During the 100 Years' War, that will go lost, right? The Burgundians and the English march and rule from Paris. Paris, by the way, was naturally the most important city in France, but still it didn't have that level of centralization you can find, for example, in London and England. London was an earlier and more, let's say, capital for the English kingdom than Paris was for the French one. And in part this favored probably the same French during the 100 Years' War, because even though they lost Paris, they took refuge in Orléans. That was literally the last, actual French monarchic power in there of the Valois. But they had this ability to still maintain this coordinate net of the pro-monarchic party all over France and across France, and to resist and eventually to strike back and to win the war in the first place. This is being due also thanks to this this scattered this let's say this administrative apparatus that had been worked in these previous years, right? We could say that the key word in the statual policy of the French kings was for a long time the one of a Reformacion. That is, a reformation that, since the first ordinance of Louis IX in 1254, intended to pose certain specific limits to the aggressiveness, especially the fiscal aggressiveness of the royal officials, towards the requests of the various components of the political society, and that were mediated through the famous doléances, right? The famous cahier de doléances, also if you remember from the French Revolution, before the French Revolution, and that and of their representatives, by the way, that since the 13th century were united in the Estates General, the three states. Now this system was quite clever, because what was the point? The point is that now the French monarchy in the 13th century had acquired quite a massive authority in the kingdom, and managed to have imposed, right, its prerogatives on this administrative point of view. The problem, though, is that the local communities said, okay, yeah, but we are also here. So basically, the French king was here mitigating its own power, nominally, right, to say, okay, I have royal officials that I send to collect taxes that are my men, right, my representatives on the territory, but I'll see what I can do, right, when these doléances were, sent to him, so that he could essentially negotiate the royal prerogatives and the local ones on the territory. Now, this, on the long run, was very remunerative, because, of course, the monarchy was starting as a seigneury on its own, right, as a power on its own, to have its own, negotiable power, right. Remember, in this regard, that the Capetian monarchy, we made a video on the rise of the Capetians, making of Capetian France, and emerged in a time in which, especially in France, public power was de facto to approximate to zero, right? And therefore, the same French monarchy, as many other monarchies, telling the truth, had emerged as private seigneuries on their own, right? There were, as the Count of Champagne or the of Anjou, there was then the French king in the Ile-de-France, and had managed to, quite cleverly, I would say, to and successfully to expand with the same private means the of the nobility his own prerogatives. So this negotiation with local communities was possible exactly in virtue of this pre-existing power, but the idea was that not just the king could limit its own, like, let's say the king had taxed a community, right? The community sent this appeal, says, your men are abusing, their power, they're, belittling us, we don't like this. And the king said, okay, then what do you want to exchange? And this was a way of co-opting at a local level certain elites, essentially. So to do what exactly? To consolidate the power of someone in these local communities in exchange for the royal legitimization, because this could pass through the recognition by the king. That was a hell of an important thing. Unfortunately, during the French Revolution, all those angry peasants burnt most of this stuff, these foundations of privileges of the French nobility. We lack all of that. It's a disaster, a shame of human civilization, but hey, that's history as well. The point here is that through this game, effectively, the king could, from one side, still have its part of his prerogatives reasserted locally in exchange for, the consolidation of some private power that, however, was directly depending on him now. Now, this is just to spend a word in favor partly of the French Revolution. Of course, this is exactly the way, in part, I mean, not only, but also the way, oppression in this system began on the lower strata of the population that basically were excluded, and in France had been historically excluded. Even you can see back to Gallo-Roman and Frankish society, right, from the from the politics, of the kingdom, let's call it, at that point. So this favored increasingly social stratification, but also in increased control, direct control, and it contributed to simplifying, to uniform, in fact, the same royal administration on these territories. Also, the growth of the 14th century of the professionals in administration, right? Especially, this is very important, right? Especially in the world of the university jurists. This is something we have seen also in the in that video we made on Spain recently, actually, on the same evolution. Institutional transformation in the Iberian monarchies. You see exactly that, especially in the both in Castilla and Aragon. So of this skilled, in fact, lay and non-noble scholars, right, that, however, never happened, at least almost never happened in counterposition, but in symbiosis, rather, with the pre-existing social structures, both with the seigneurial elites and the elites of the communes, of the French communes, of the cities. So these were essentially individuals who were sided, the local administration, but at the same time were referenced to the king, and also having their definitely their job, their space in this broader university system was growing, also thanks to royal foundation, right? Founding a university at this point means to have, first of all, money, because there are people who come from all over Europe. I mean, think about Paris, it was especially in theology the greatest university in Europe. But also you have all this extremely skilled personnel, these intellectual resources that you can use and you need to acquire in order to build a state with an administration, education, notaries, jurists, lawyers, all people that have to make this enormous thing work. And for the time standards, the Kingdom of France is really enormous, right? So it's somewhat a subtle mean, the one that French kings use after all. They don't enter directly, with iron fists. They're pretty clever to enter in all these gaps that formed in that were requiring also, that were requested in part by the same communities. And the royal and princely service that didn't limitate itself just to the functional, the administrative world, let's say, contributed to maintain this way the supremacy of a system of aristocratic values. This is also very interesting. That was strengthened by denobilitizations in mass, right, of the royal administrative elite, right, and that was being rooted also in the urban world. How? Well, quite simply, noblesse de robe, noblesse d'épée, right? So the noblesse de robe, well, exactly these, in fact, non-noble individuals, usually jurists, that were, provided with certain prerogatives, including, a form of humility at some point, that existed also in the Middle Ages and elsewhere, right? Jurists were enormously, venerated by the local society. There were people who really embodied the success and the prestige of the communities that had produced them, because it meant that they emerged from economically active and intellectually vivacious areas, powerful communities, right? But the aristocratization of these values, this is very important, like the promise of co-opting these non-noble men into a noble status. And this works all the time, and it's done very, very often. And it starts taking root, not just in this milieu that were partly already depending via the universities, especially on the king, but also in the cities, right? The French cities, especially towards the end of the period, and you see it better in the early modern age, had a great role in the institutional functionment of the French kingdom. There were points of reference for the king on the local administration. Sometimes they were working as states on their own. They were terribly wealthy, and it was also in their this is easily seen also in the Kingdom of England. I mean, how the king sometimes nobilitated them by sojourning there, therefore being maintained by them and not spending money in the court, and therefore also in there creating bonds, prestigious clienteles, giving privileges, and rendering the city an ever more important center by itself, often detached from the detached from the countryside, especially towards the thresholds of the modern age, right? That worked literally as a bit of a state on its own, right? There were many important cities in this regard. So all this process, as we were saying before, was definitely not unitary and linear, right? At the time, like today, of course, we study this for didactic purpose the French kingdom evolved in that way. This didn't evolve. It was a set of transformations, sometimes contingential, right? So at the time, these provisions were enacted, on the occasion, right? And progressively, however, gradually, they formed something of a more consistent structure and system, right? But at the time of Philip IV, who knew what the future of France could be, right? They could wish for one, but they wouldn't know. And this development yet is exponential, right? And this is especially observable from the the rise of the institutes and of the personnel of royal government from the mid-13th to the end of the 15th century. Yet you can find 4 stages, approximately, for the sake of, didactic approach. So, first there is quantitative and also documentary consolidation of the governmental apparatuses, both in the center, Paris, and on the territory, right? And this goes in the from 1254 to 1330, circa, which is in fact the moment of greatest push of the French monarchy, especially of greatest expansion, literally, followed by towards the end, or there was already the feeling of the crisis coming, but then you find the qualitative development of the royal ideology and service, right? So in this moment of crisis, what happens is that there is a new propagandistic, emotional, ideological approach to the idea of the monarchy that is seen here as increasingly as a necessity, as a spiritual thing, and this goes in parallel with the growth of the governmental interventions in it complexively in politics and society through the Estates Generals, and with the rooting of certain principates provided with similar administrative structures to the royal ones. So you see here the crisis. This happened roughly after 1332, like the 1380, let's say, because it was evident that, the system had enlarged in the previous generation, was solid, was robust, right? But at the same time, now the contraction brought the need of, first of all, in part having to explain the failure of the expansion at some point, the regression and the first problems had started to occur, and therefore also partly to revert to more sound assets, maybe also with an increased territorialization. This is still, exactly during the Black Death, and we know that the major economical changes of that were the gradual, like the finance had already collapsed in the previous decades. At this point, every policy reinvests heavily on the land, and this naturally brings to a territorialization, a compaction of territorial dominations. Hence also the importance of not of venturism like during the Crusades or in the Mediterranean like in the previous generations, but to find new opportunities, but to consolidate what was already present in France, right? And hence the rise also of powers like the Duchy of Burgundy, that had always been there but hadn't taken the turn that it would take at that point, expanding as a major territorial domination in the heart of Europe. Then the toughest moment happens, right? The already after Crécy and the Black Death, as we've seen, and other major massive also strategic losses at some point of the kingdom, and losses. Think about the Battle of Poitiers, where literally the French king was taken captive and they had to pay an enormous amount of money. This triggered the Jacquerie, because all the peasantry in France said, but our king is being, he is an inept, just been captured, was now to pay for all of this, it's going to be us. So many peasants were literally without any choice. So there is this massive set of peasant revolts that were actually pretty brutal and got also pretty brutally repressed. So moments of major strife and difficulty, but definitely the moment in which the French kingdom went the closest to collapse was this moment of, in fact, conflict at the same top of the institution of the monarchical institutions, with the competition of different forms of political preeminence and in the development of sort of informal, places of power, right? Courts, ceremonies, factions. Think about the Armagnacs and Bourguignon. This happens, in fact, between 1380 and 1430, so in the darkest hour. Think about up to the siege of Orléans, right, and the comeback of Jeanne d'Arc, and so on. So that was really the toughest moment, in which the French monarchy was reduced literally just to Orléans, right? The rest had been French, northern France had been occupied by the English and by the Burgundians. Then there is the revival of French power in the moment of greatest, once again, comeback and also of territorial expansion, further even the boundaries that had been proper of the monarchy up to that point nominally, up to the wars of Italy. And this phase sees the strengthening of monarchic power, right? Also thanks to renewed and decentralized territorial control, and to the development of groups of officials that were basically now ineliminable from the institutional system, and the integration, let's call it in this way, within the kingdom of the various peripheral principalities, and their together with their own institutions, right? So Burgundy, is the greatest example. Think about Artois, Hainaut, etc. So lands that had been also, contended by the French monarchy from the locals, and the expansion of France as a major power now was beginning to trouble everybody. And what France does when it's reunified once again, well, it invades Naples once again, that in the meanwhile had fallen to the Aragonese hands. And the wars of Italy began, and eventually France France at this point is literally a giant. It's an enormous thing that nobody can match. Like just the other major power is the Ottoman Empire in Europe, and France sees itself renewedly as effectively as a universal monarchy. Right? If you look at the mentality of Francis I, for example, he was literally like, aside from running as Holy Roman Emperor, right, in competition with Charles V, but also considering, for example, Italy just as a extension of France, as a territory that pertained to the French king by right, and they had to dominate, right, and towards which there was all the problem of the Milanese succession and the rights of the French crown and so on. So, but it was at this point once again a restored enormous power, right? And the French had the greatest military power at that point. So how does the whole thing develop after all in practice? So in the first period that we have highlighted, that basically precedes the 100 Years' War in 1337, corresponds certainly to the consolidation of the political administrative institutions of the Kingdom of France. So from Louis IX to Charles the IV, you can see essentially the formation and the codification, especially of the central apparatuses. Right? This is a moment in which the French monarchy gives itself a different substance, right, of a central power that is hegemonic in the kingdom's boundaries, with this firm stabilization in Paris as a capital, as a center, and that contextually provide themselves with an autonomous documentary production. Remember what we said before, also the Angevin and Papal models here that play a role. Well, exactly, that's what the French do in Paris as well. So, from the Royal Hotel, that was basically this group of courtly of officials of the king were detached. Those judiciary, financially and controlling apparatuses, such as the supreme organism of justice, that is the parliament, the personnel which is still ecclesiastic for the majority, and its registers also take form under Louis IX, so it's a very precocious institution in the sense that it really enters quite early into the functioning of the government, while the treasury and the court of the auditors, that would be developed instead at the beginning of the 14th century. At the same time, also the connections within the administration, territory, and society were strengthened to the bailiffs and the seneschals that were, the regional coordinators of the activities of the prévôt and the châtelain at a local level, were cited, for example, the collectors of extraordinary taxes. Also, that the control of the incomes constituted, from that point, a strategical sector for the royal administration is demonstrated by the reunions of representative assemblies, right? The Estates Generals, that to whom the nobility, the clergy, and the urban elites participated, right? And also, this is witnessed by the appearance of a more, consistent seigneurial opposition represented by literal nobiliar leagues, right? This representative assemblies, happened, for example, in 1302, 1314, right? So the nobility, the clergy, and urban elites said, okay, what's going on here? Why would we have to pay more taxes? Nobiliar leagues appear in 1314, 1315, right? So from one side, there is this royal necessity at all costs to dispose of a large fiscal consensus. From the other side, there is the seigneurial demand to limit these collection. In this deeply rooted conviction that the king had to leave of his own stuff, right, avoiding to pose too many limits to the autonomy of seigneurial powers at the local level, especially. This was really a big deal, right? Because here we're talking about the same people who eventually make war in the royal army, and that have, you must negotiate with. So you can't simply ignore what their instances are. I mean, these are people you have to cope with, because they can potentially even rebel or depose you or start other problems, right? And generally speaking, the system holds at this point, so it's not a dramatic. And actually, all the blows, think about even the defeats in Flanders, I mean, these are pretty, there is still a general consensus and ideal concord and unity revolving around the monarchical concept. France at this point is solidly a monarchy. There is no question about that. The point is, how much can the system hold by keeping to squeeze great part of the assets that at this point there is a major, really, economic crisis, and the system has to remain afloat in a way or another. This, however, doesn't mean that, for example, the Capetians first and the Valois afterwards didn't provide themselves of documentary and governmental structures aimed at the territorial coordination. Right, in 1328, for example, there is this major census, right, demographic and fiscal alike, was wanted by the monarchy, and it was not complete of the whole France. It was known as État de paroisse et de feu, which means the state of parishes and of the fires, that is the households, right? How the were family nucleus were counted, and this document is very important, and it shows definitely the will of the king to know, also in an administrative fashion, what is that, the ensemble of French territory basically is, right? In what all these communities are about, and how in this first encompassment of an entire territory that is the one that pertains to the French monarchy by law. So after so let's enter this phase of the qualitative growth of these system that at this point, as you understand, has extended chiefly from a quantitative point of view. So after 1330, the monarchy enters in this moment of political and military hardships, right? Also social strains, because the two things go in parallel, as always. And in these moments, the quantitative growth of the royal apparatuses had to be given up, right? And leaving room, however, for a more qualitative development in the process of statal construction, right? From one side, the institutions provide themselves with a stable personnel, right? So salaried officials, right? We're talking financial experts and jurists, right? That are also ever more specialized professionally, and also more often laymen, right? This is evident, for example, if you take the Parisian Parlement, that whose members, starting from the 1345, are appointed basically without limits of time. So this meant that at least was based of a body of officials who was ever more present within the royal council, right? On the other hand, the royal representatives refined their territorial control by modifying the city hierarchies, right? So in the north of France, in the Languedoc, it's the bailiffs, right? And in Languedoc, in Occitane, it's the seneschals that are installed by the monarchy in the major urban centers that eventually at this point start becoming really points of reference for the administration, right? That strengthen, therefore, their characteristics or regional capitals in some way, right? And that become political media between the center and the territory. Now, this is important because, especially thinking that the southern France at this point went through a solid trade crisis, because the usual Mediterranean imports that passed through Provence and the Rhone Valley through the north, and the Champagne fairs that at this point in fact are declining brutally, pass elsewhere, because the Italians take either the Atlantic route across the Gibraltar Strait, or through the Alps in Bavaria, right? So trade routes, we made several videos about this, shift brutally. In southern France, cities like Marseille, that had been of major importance for European trade for centuries, start to shake a little. And therefore, I think that the financial crisis in that regard brought the same city elites to invest on the land in the surrounding districts, and therefore the monarchy seizes this opportunity to to stabilize their power in that regard in exchange for these appointees, royal appointees in the local cities that definitely are not much appreciated, but at least respond to to the lost security, the lost prestige of these financial elites and still to the territorial control ones of the monarchy. And they, because the cities simply have become important on a territorial point of view, right? At this point, literally the range, it's fascinating because I'm studying exactly the first half of the 14th century, so this is already a bit beyond, but you can see that even at that point the French monarchy has, as many other most European powers at that point, have an ever smaller, shorter range of action, especially via land, so that the theater of operations, let's say, is always narrower in this regard. There is always less capability, and there is a need to evidently territorialize, as we were saying before, the power within within France itself. So that's why these cities are so important, because from a royal perspective, those are, for example, perfect anti-nobiliar power, right, traditionally. And incidentally are also the seats of universities and the skilled personnel that the king uses for its own bureaucracy. So you understand that everything goes at its place, right? Here it's fairly logical. And for what concerns the administrative specialists, the administrative activities, right, of these appointees, of these officials, well, there are lieutenants that are appointed by the king and that become specialized in tax collection, right? That were called the receivers, and after 1355 of the generals of the finance and their local reference, the élus, that are elected by the States General to cash and to collect on the territory this extraordinary taxes. So you see basically that there is a progressive stratification even within the administrative hierarchy here, right? That there is always a more specialized, professional, and structured and articled administrative personnel. On the other hand, however, there is also more need for the approval of local communities, right? So this process of greater royal infiltration in the territory is paralleled by the growing political importance of the representative assemblies, so that the major choices of government commit the whole French political society, both at a regional level and with the especially with the development after 1345 of the provincial estates, right? And also through the requests of Reformacion of the States General. In 1357, for example, a great ordinance suspended royal officials and appointed nine new reformers that were 3 bishops, right? That confirms the traditional presence of the clergy in the royal administration and the natural preferential ties between the church and the monarchy, right? Very, very ancient in France. Then 2 barons, exactly in the moment in which was codified the fiscal exemption of the French nobility. 2 universitaries to demonstrate the importance of the centers of intellectual professional education, where Nicole Oresme translates, for example, in French, Aristotle's policy on politics. And then 2 bourgeois, we can say, that are chosen among the representatives of the states of roughly 200 bonnes villes, right? So these good cities that were chosen, right, to participate to this election, right, providing these representatives, and that are definitely both the nuclei of local power and also centers that are very strongly related with royal authority, that decided which bonne ville could be such, right? So that there was a competition within the French cities to effectively be appointed in that regard, and in order to acquire this prerogative, and for which they had to compete with one another who appeared to be more faithful to the sovereign, right? And exactly in this same time, such forms and instruments of political power were rooted also outside of the royal environment in the various territories that were devoted to the members of the ruling lineage, and also in the contiguous principalities such as Bretagne, the Dauphiné, and Savoie, right? So these new instruments enumerated definitely the central local administration, as we've seen. So a recapitulation, the courts, as we've seen before, the courts of auditors, then the bailiffs, the châtelains, also the formation of specialized officials, right? The commitment of the regional political society through this local assemblies. There are, as we've seen here, basically certain feudal elements that were appanage of the monarchy, usually the same Duchy of Burgundy, right? And which basically, even as a feudal possession becomes a sort of tool in the hands of the monarchy, but it will go out of hand at one point because it's becoming too powerful. And then also the continuous request and commitment of these other entities of Bretagne that will not be incorporated in France for a long time, the Dauphiné in Savoie in the southeast, that also have quarrels with each other because the Dauphiné and Savoie keep fighting against each other. This is a sign both of the modeling value acquired in the process of politics and administration in the construction of the French state, but also the limits of royal authority in itself, right? That evidently cannot control all this immense territory in a uniform and absolute fashion. That's what in fact triggers the major crisis in the French kingdom at this point. So the long reign of Charles VI from 1380 to 1422 demonstrates, from one side, by the way, in a moment of great uncertainties, as you know, and from a political point of view, but also military defeats, how rooted actually codified model of government, and also a tendentially statualized one, and how much this system could, the monarchy was recognized, even informally sometimes, the character of authority. Like it's as if the French system, when it was blown out after, major, think about Azincourt, right? This system kept working on its own. So France kept existing as a government in some way. There was still the idea that it was also an external enemy at this point, and it's kind of, it's anachronistic to think here that it was like the French against the English, because it doesn't make sense. But at the same time, it was definitely like a local system that was reacting by tradition, by belief, by allegiance and commitment to what was perceived as a someone else that was coming to seize it and to overthrow the regime. This aided the French monarchy, right? And probably any other kingdom would have collapsed at that point, also in its administration, right? This thing instead shows that the French monarchy, after all, had set its basis right, that in spite of all the difficulties to try to to work with all these communities, to try to develop gradually the control of the monarchy, the essentials were rooted now, right? And that the monarchy was to be in fact incorporated rather than destroyed by the English, by also the Burgundians that had their own, that saw the thing as partly as a third element, even though they were technically allied with the English most of the times, but not directly. That they were still feeling to be French, doing something specific here within, in fact, the monarchic institution, right? Within the kingdom proper, the kingdom. That's the point. The royaume. It was not just a word. It meant a lot to the spirituality of the French. Naturally, we see that this is, also this perspective has been criticized because you say, what the hell do you think? How do you think you can know about, I don't know, what a peasant at that time thought like about all this? Of course. But definitely, if this society is ruled by the elites, and these elites have detained power, and the same peasants work for these elites, well, at this point, what I care about is also definitely understanding why the system eventually managed to stand in place, and it's obvious that there was a moral strength behind this structure that, in spite of the massive blows that it took in the defeats against the English, managed to stand back on its feet, and to also re-expand with brutal force at the end of the war. So it's not a few, believe me. And that's why this was a moment of great, not just political, but also ideological clashes, right? That saw the opposition since 1388, and also, especially after the recognized incapability of Charles VI from 1392, of these two major factions. From one side, under the guide of the Duke of Orléans, there was the king's brother, the makers of regular administrative and fiscal intervention of the royal functionaries that were represented first by some familiars of Charles VI, the so-called marmozette. They were the monkeys, literally, as they were called by contempt by Froissart, the famous chronicle, and eventually by the Armagnac jurists. From the other side, these were the legitimists. From the other side was the party of the Reformacion, in an anti-fiscal sense, right? Dominated by the Dukes of Burgundy, that were often backed by, very importantly, the Parisian public opinion. This is very important because if you look at even today's policy, right, there's always the side of centralization, more taxes, decentralization, less taxes, right? But it's not that simple, because objectively there's always kind of a balance that for which none of the two sides can ever prevail. But here the thing is way more complicated by less taxes, but to what aim objectively? Especially where you're being invaded in here. Especially, what do you think that the Dukes of Burgundy here were allied with Parisian bourgeoisie because they shared the same values? Hell no. The Dukes of Burgundy were some of the most noble aristocratic elements here. They spitted on the Parisian bourgeoisie. But the Parisian bourgeoisie has the money and has also always this popular obsession for okay, we have to pay okay, let's not pay taxes. Well, okay, but you have an enemy in your own home. Okay, you may pass from the side of this new monarchy, you can side with the English, but let's be honest, well, wouldn't it better, after all, that this whole French kingdom stood on its feet, and that maybe you're able to take it forward with a further expansion of French power? I mean, okay, yeah, you may be be choked in your individual personal ambitions by a monarch that rules exactly from there, but well, come on, and this is interesting because this Parisian anti-monarchic take had happened also during the Jacquerie, and this was very risky because even in here you think that the bourgeoisie actually liked the peasantry. The bourgeoisie at this point was very aristocratic minded as well, right? And they spitted on peasants in turn. But the peasants could be the armed, arm, in fact, of the revolt, and to back their power. But eventually this failed. And the fact that they failed, that all these groups failed, right? So one side we have the Dukes of Burgundy, the Parisian middle classes, the peasantry. Who wins? The monarchy. So you gotta admit at this point that this monarchy had hell of pretty damn solid foundations, whichever thing it was, and that after all, right, this system was not so obstacled and refused, right? And during an invasion, during a war, where you tend to see things a bit differently from just, I don't want to pay taxes, right? Because wars are moments in which you must pay taxes because it's your interest to eventually be free and able to decide what you can do here or not, and hoping to destroy everything around you, hoping that you will emerge more freely from chaos, right? Because they were obviously hoping that Paris would be, maybe English ruled, but the English king would come back to London, preferably. Maybe they would stay in Paris, who knows, as French kings. But this thing will stabilize as well one day, and okay, you will make money in a short while. Is it all you're interested in? Okay, but it doesn't seem to be a good recipe for even the people who are going to blame you eventually for what you've done, and in fact, these people paid dearly for it as well. So once again, this is the usual Schwerpunkt backing, the orthodoxy in the establishment. But I do feel, in historical perspective, that consensus towards the monarchy, especially in that date, is quite meaningful because France is objectively an exception in this regard, and very other few monarchies had all these faith, right? These kingdoms, had faith in their own monarchy. A substantial chunk of France did have this faith, and also more trivial interests, by the way, but still from the side of the monarchy, right? In their ordinances, the Marmousets and the Armagnacs defended a politics that was founded on this general recourse on taxation that determined essentially a social hierarchy, right, whose vertexes found themselves exempt from taxes. So the clergy and the nobility, this is also a reason why maybe the Parisian middle classes didn't want, right, to back up that side. And you have to understand this as well, right? So the imposition, the monarchy definitely imposed itself where it could, right? This was a world where, it's not like, state of right like the ones we live, right? This is a constant negotiation with strengths that, not excessively has changed, but today we live in an easier world, right? Where the state is stronger and can grant certain rights, etc. At the time, the situation was bad, right? So even if you arrive at the French Revolution at one point, there is centuries of objective oppression for lots of people that had maybe not thought that what would happen could happen, but that in that specific moment made it happen, because evidently they deemed it to be necessary in a way or another. And also the royal officials enjoyed such tax exemption for the marmoussi. So this can be seen as an extreme attempt of the monarchy actually to grant these jobs, right, in the administration, to make the administration, not to make the administration crumble, right? If you have such a big interest and you do it for saving your own state, well, you can't. It's a pretty damn smart move as well, right? So another point to the monarchy, in my opinion. And in the meanwhile, by the way, the same administration had kept growing, like in spite of all the crisis, right? Still, the state had made some progress. Also, the ideology of the royal supremacy, that is both a juridical and also of ceremonial point of view, and also on a class of government, a sort of stratum of the population that effectively makes a living within the monarchic administration, right, constituted by professionals of justice, of war as well. Military commanders here are growing in importance and nobility, and also professionals of finance. All of this passed through the service of the prince. So you understand here how many people gravitated also around the monarchy, why there was such great cohesion around the crown. The crown was literally developing a sort of religion of state, like the idea of literally, I mean, as we will see now with the pragmatic sanction of 1437, but I mean the same rituals of the court, for example, and its centrality, all the rites of crowning, in the funerals, right? The funerals of French kings are some of the most beautiful rites ever, like when they brought them in the crypt, with the aside from the this idea that there's Cantorovich's the King's Two Bodies, that is one of the most beautiful books I've ever read. It really tells you how this actually stemmed from England and eventually passed to France, but France had probably the most moving and the truly greatest sense of what a monarchy is, right? There was the French standard, right, that was kept high all the time during the funeral, right? And there were two bodies fundamentally. One was fake and was made on the resemblance of the king, and that represented the never dying king. Then there was the body of the king, the dead king. It was buried together with the the arrows burnt down, the banners, the swords, the weapons. So all the symbols of power that died with it, the man. So this was the man. While the effigy of the king, of the mortal king, this is the concept. It was outside, but a salute for the man, for the mortal king, for the body of the true king. I'll say of the dead king, was for one moment acknowledged by the French banner that, famously was brought down so that the herald cried, "Le roi est mort," and then he was rising again immediately. Just for 1 second it was brought down, and then "Vive le roi," right? So the French banner, the banner of France proper, right? I mean, all it means historically, politically, identitarily, bows 1 second to the man, to the dead man, but rises once again, forever, because car la bannière ne meurt jamais, right? Because the banner of France never dies. The monarchy never dies. There is a continuity here, and this boosted enormously the French moral, right? And this is something that literally dated back to the Merovingian times. There's the sense that there is a mystical bond between the monarchy and the people, and that is, I mean, objectively what existed also in the other monarchies. But in the case of the French sovereigns, this was developed as a even exteriorly as a part of the French identity and obedience and faithfulness to the crown. Also the royal entrance in the cities, for example, was an enormous deal. There were, there are also a lot of competitions within the cities, as we were saying before, for who would host the king and things like these. So the king's adversaries intended instead to limitate actually monarchic power through the limitation in turn of the range of action of the officials. So from a political and administrative point of view, really keeping them out, and using the support of the local communities, right? We're talking about the seigneurial aristocracy that, as we have seen, was on the fore for contrasting the king's prerogatives, the urban mercantile elites, even the Parisian popular masses. It's very famous, the revolt of this fish seller, right? Simon Caboche, hence the ordinance known as the Cabochen in 1413, right? He was the head of this popular faction that had a revolt, and this competition appears therefore eminently internal to the statual organization, right? This is a clash that is occurring fundamentally within the same France. So this is meaningful because, albeit you can see that one side is kind of more disruptive towards, what was the alternative? Very often we don't know. But there is a revolution. This often stems from, immediate frustrations that, however, people just care to get rid of it at the moment, but don't really think what can be next like. And that's also where disasters happen, and France knows something about it in historical perspective. And France is in fact been always like this. I mean, there's always been a deep inner social tension in all times, right? You can't see it from the Jacquerie to the revolutions of the 18th to 19th century, right? All in. It's a country also where the political factions vary pretty, can vary pretty massively. So this means objectively that even the same system is capable of moving within the boundaries of itself, and this is the point, that there is an itself. That's why the idea of France remains, after all. That's why the system doesn't break down, because it doesn't matter how strained it can be, this thing has always remained standing, right? It's never broken apart, and you must give to it an enormous deal of credit for it, especially in times in which the state was basically non-existent. So it's not that you could keep it together on the point of bayonets with firearms, etc., like in with Napoleon. And this, this is Middle Ages. You have to convince someone to be from your side. You have to give something in exchange, and that this system opted still for the centralistic, legitimistic, monarchic model is very meaningful. It can depend. I mean, there are very, many ways in which you can interpret it. It can also be about land distribution, wealth distribution, the fact that France was already politically and socially oriented in an aristocratic fashion since, at this point, literally from a millennium or... but, France didn't eventually collapse in itself. It was still to become a major player in all European history. So this system managed to achieve something after all. It was not just an internal, deviation of a tyrannical tension, right? So this is the real point, that the competition between these blocks appears eminently internal to the statual organization. right? Those are the horizons, right? Essentially, it's a debate that revolves around the diverging opinion in the construction of a political authority, right? And how we don't fully know how this would have been developed alternatively, but it still was within France itself. In fact, you could be realistic in saying that really these two factions actually shared the same governmental culture. It wasn't a social struggle after all, right? In part it was also so, but it was still a clienterly connection of the courtesan environments. These were still the nobility essentially managing the thing. Yes, it was using new forms of legitimization of the kings, of control on the administrative apparatuses, but they were the same people. I mean, literally, the Burgundians were the same Valois. They were the same family, same royal family. So, come on. So, going into, per aspera ad astra, we can say, to the end of the 100 Years' War, to the coming back, to the French victory, etc. It's starting basically only from the mid of the 15th century, and actually we start from the very end of the from the very comeback of the French in the 100 Years' War, is that witnessed the development of royal but also national ideology, right? National with all the approximations of the case, but it's really about France here. That's why I stress it so much. That is embodied by none less than Jeanne d'Arc. So Jeanne d'Arc, you know the story, and she, there's a, wherever you go in France, there is a statue of her, legitimately so, and naturally the history is widely more complex, but we see here that she led a victorious campaign in an anti-English sense. This is the important side of the story. Yes, okay, the 100 Years' War was about dynastic struggle, it was not about national identities, but here we're talking about the 15th century, so something proto-national, whatever you want to call it, like there is here, right? This policy is naturally led by the future Charles VII, right? That is stressing naturally the royal authority cited by his official and professionals of the administration that have become now basically almost ineliminable from the institution. Especially with the Ordinance of 1467, this will be sanctioned, and the king gave life at this point of this process of authoritarian statal construction that would be splendidly eradicated in France at this point. Right, it was in some ways also often crises bring the opportunity to restart from a certain amount of scratch, so that you can effectively restructure things that do not work in the sense that before you couldn't do. This happens very often. You need a disaster like the French strategic situation in the end of the 1420s to be able to eventually reborn with this capability of restructuring France. And France was restructured at this point, right? This model basically was founded also on a military base, right? The French now had the availability of a salaried and permanent army since 1445, basically. The origins of this were more than 1 century old. Like, the French are some of the first powers that effectively that do not disband at some point their mercenaries, that maintain part of continuity in the armed forces. But from 1445, you have really, this solid power that can afford now a permanent armed force to in fact, to enforce the royal authority, right? Not just in process of dissipation of the English power in France, but also within the same France against the nobility and the other opponents. There is also the political hegemony over the French church with the pragmatic sanction of 1437. You know that there is the Gallicanism is this tendency to create a church, a Catholic church that will remain firmly Catholic church of France, but the first referential, which is the French king, is not the papacy, right? And this is very important. Like the French had struggled for this for a long time, keep doing it fundamentally, and the revived, let's say better, French monarchy after the war is able to obtain also this within its boundaries, but the Pope couldn't do much after all about it. And also there is the presence of ever thicker and also and wider, right, administrative and fiscal net. Then the definitive insertion within the kingdom of the majority of the old principalities, right? After the defeat of the English, the French monarchy keeps on fighting and incorporating, especially in the northeast, a lot of territories that at this point had also been part of Burgundy, right? It's Burgundy that gets reincorporated finally and meaningfully, especially after the disaster against the Swiss Confederacy into the French crown. Then there is a royal control on the political society, not much at this point through the reunions of their representative assemblies, but rather through the monopoly of the nobilitizations, right? The development of an elite of servant officers of the state that is capable of actually posing a valid alternative to the old social superiority of the seigneuries, of the feudal lords, right? And hence the distinction between the noblesse de robe and noblesse de paix. And this is meaningful because it would remain, in fact, in France as a very important base for the construction of the modern state, and it would be, strengthened but further. But it started from these moments. Also, consider the quantity of people who literally depended on the king, clientarily speaking. Think that by 1470, 35% of the neat revenue of Louis XI was spent in pensions, courtly pensions, for the personal clienteles of the monarch, right? So the monarch now is literally paying people, as always, but now in a very consistent way to work to remain under his control, to remain faithful to him, and making them depend on his money. So lots of people depend on them, and this is actually true also for other, for other magnates, let's say, of the kingdom. But it's equally meaningful that so much resources from the same king are devolved for such, for building such consensus, right? So this is definitely a process of monarchical centralization that, however, do not have to make us think that we're all coming straight from those, changes in the, in that intense work of construction of the royal authority and of French politics in the previous 2 centuries, right? They came out of a situation that could go very differently, right? This unstable balance between the service of the prince and the social representatives of excuse me, of the Estates General were, you know, not so obvious in the outcome. You know, I think also the professional administration and seigneurial power, right? At that point, you have even an evident asymmetry on the base of which, you know, these can exist, right? It's the king that basically, as a lord, on his own, pays for this professional administration. There is definitely also on the territory this first development of central apparatus and the importance of the however, those communities that had remained out of this system, right, whether landed seigneuries or, you know, urban centers, so much that at the end of the 15th century, the French monarchy, from the height of its power, international prestige, right, kept to make recourse to numerous compromises in order to set off, at least temporarily, the nobiliary position and to strengthen the control on, you know, local particularisms as it would be observed in 1454, where there was this national campaign of, you know, put in written form of all the various territorial customs that was, as we were saying before, the end, if you want, of this attempt to discipline all the various local customs with a sort of monarchical control and intervention over the same. Okay, so yeah, I think this is what I wanted to talk about today. And it's not I mean, I like this constant I mean, from one side, the idea that there was a base, a continuity in the French state since a very long time, but that at the same time we don't have to be fooled by the fact that objectively things have gone the way they've gone. Hence, we can't stress a deterministic proof of this, of an evolution of sort. The French monarchy evolved through a very complicated path that took centuries to effectively accomplish a definitive union. Like this would unity. This would happen finally and truly, chiefly with Louis XIV. Like you can't see it historically speaking in a much of a different dimension, right? The modern, you have to wait the modern state to take over, right? And it took a lot of centuries still, because that happened at the end, second half of the modern age, right? To essentially absorb all this nobiliary resistances, to commit them into the participation of the state and in the fealty to the monarchy. At this point, it's still a very complex and unstable system that must be controlled with ways that are often yet to be determined along the way, right? And it can't be simply foreseen or, you know, deterministically explained. It's obvious that we will have to discuss more in depth also the political and military, also social, you know, dynamics that effectively allowed this on the forward. This video was just looking a bit from the above, saying, okay, well, this is more or less what happened, and we can see why it happened. How, I mean, what were the players that allowed this to happen? At the same time, we have to understand that in turn, all these systems were very, very, very complicated, right, on their own, and can't be fully understood, unfortunately. But we can get a good idea, and we'll have to deepen this topic further. Anyhow, for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.